So to all of those who are joining us today, again, I'd like to thank you for taking the time out of what is otherwise probably staying at home to pay attention to some of the ideas that we're going to throw out there. This is now, I think, the fourth installment of the series. The first installment was very COVID oriented. Now that we seem to be a little more, accommodating around COVID and countries are opening up, perhaps the urgency to discuss all of those critical issues isn't there so much. I also got a lot of criticism in the past, in the last few weeks, on why I was interviewing only males in suits. And so this is our token female, Dr. Muneera, probably the highest qualified person that we are actually interviewing. You got your PhD from Oxford, which again is one of the finest, if not the finest university in the world. And your research was around, what is it, international norms, national identity, and essentially kind of a historical approach to these questions. You founded the Diplomatic Institute in Bahrain, which then became the Mohammed bin Mubarak Al Khalifa Academy for Diplomatic Studies. So can you tell us just initially, this is it's a school that trains Bahraini diplomats, I assume.
Yes, so we are mandated with recruiting, so we do the testing and then training diplomats, juniors to seniors to ambassadors, and setting them off the world.
Fantastic. So you're essentially the godmother of all Bahraini diplomacy, which is an excellent thing.
I think what I tend to do is I bring people in and I confuse them and then prepare them for the world. So I think that's essentially what we do. But we're also interested in research. We're a function of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We combine training with skill training, academics. And so I'm a hybrid. I'm a confused hybrid of an academic meets diplomat.
Superb, superb. So I think you wanted to sort of give a few prepared words, and then we can sort of dig in a little more.
Sure. Before I start, I'm not used to Zoom. In fact, I think, as you mentioned, I went to an academic institution that preferred to stick to historical norms. We had our exam instructions in Latin, so we were not very technologically advanced. I'll blame my technological incompetence entirely on them, but it is obviously entirely my fault. So please bear with me. How to adapt to webinars.
I have to say, Dr. Muneera, as long as your computer doesn't run out of battery, you're fine, because that's exactly what happened to me in one of my talks.
It's charged. It's on the charger.
Good.
Well, jokes aside, for now, I accepted. Thank you very much for having me. And I'm really happy and glad and honored to be here. Well, I'm home, but I'm glad to virtually.
Yes.
I accepted this invitation for two reasons, honestly, for the importance of such talks and for the respect and admiration I personally have for the man hosting these talks. So
thank you so much.
I begin with a thank you. I bring my perspective and experience in the field of diplomatic training. I don't, as I mentioned, I don't practice diplomacy, but I teach it. So I've prepared a few thoughts, if you'll allow me.
Please do.
I would like to add to the discussion regarding the future of diplomacy. The main point I have is that the future of diplomacy is the past. The success of any diplomat is a deep and thorough understanding of history. I know that technology matters, especially these days where this very webinar is a testament to that. I know that skills matter. Diplomats have to be great at public speaking, at negotiation, at making friends, right, left, and center, at socializing. They have to be good at the glitz and the glamour, and they also have to be solid and consistent for when the going gets tough, for mediation, for understanding and analyzing conflicts, for humanitarian efforts, confusion. They have to be resilient. They have to adapt quickly to different circumstances and have the strength to take decisions when they have to. So with this exhausting list of requirements, and obviously it goes on, why do I want to emphasize history in particular? And why for diplomats? In Oxford, my favorite seminar was titled The World Since 1900. It was a core course on the MPhil in international relations. I thoroughly enjoyed reflecting on the causes of the two world wars, on the course of the Cold War, and particularly applying the Cartesian method to help navigate and analyze these historical events. And perhaps in the very spirit of the Cartesian method, my colleagues and I soon realized the scope and content of the seminar did not reflect its title. A more relevant title would have been The Core Powers Since 1900, or Europe, US, and a Sprinkle of the Rest of the World Since 1900. It was not a reflection of the actual historical narrative of the world since 1900, and it definitely overlooked this part of the world. The history of the Arab world, the Arab Gulf, more specifically of Bahrain, because that was my area of focus, is an understudied and underappreciated field. Whether it's in renowned academic institutions abroad or even locally. While there are growing initiatives to increase research opportunities on the region or studying the region, it remains understudied. So one of the key efforts of a diplomat is to represent his or her country, to convey its messages politically, diplomatically, culturally, and economically. We therefore, as you asked at the beginning, we embark on this journey in the ministry and the ministries of foreign affairs to try to find the best candidate for the job. We try to look for the right mix in terms of ability, in terms of skill, in terms of knowledge, in terms of character. In Bahrain, similar to the UAE, we conduct a series of examinations to test knowledge, language, skills, and we conduct a series of interviews. They tend to be scary interviews, and the hope that the candidate's character will show. We then try to enable the diplomat with the tools and skills to represent his or her country. So let's imagine this for the sake of discussion. The archetype of a diplomat, the Lancelot of diplomatic skills, the most charismatic public speaker, excellent at negotiation, fluent in 4 to 5 languages, walks and talks, and exudes charm and charisma and passion. But this diplomat is also a messenger. So if he or she masters the art of diplomacy, what is the message being carried? This message is obviously the foreign policy of the nation. This message is obviously the political and economic interests of the nation. But I would also argue that the message is the narrative the nation wants to portray to the rest of the world. And this narrative needs to be anchored in history. The most charismatic public speaker needs substance, and this substance should emphasize the past as well as the present. Let me be brave and admit that we in the Arab Gulf have traditionally approached history and contemporary history, to be more precise, with caution. And allow me to elaborate on this thought. When we interview top graduates and high flyers pursuing a career in diplomacy, they often lack some knowledge required for the field. And that knowledge is often history. And it's not international history, it's history of the region. And I'll share a few examples on this, if you allow me. Bahrain gained its official status as a sovereign Arab state in 1971, when its flag was proudly raised at the UN headquarters on this 22nd of September, 1971. I'm sure many of you are aware that prior to that, Iran claimed that Bahrain was part of its territory, but based on historical claims. Bahrain attracted many empires and lots of invaders. Its geopolitical position made it accessible on trade routes. Its natural aquifers and agricultural lands made it an oasis in the middle of lands that were considered arid. And if the Persian presence in Bahrain gave Iran a legitimate claim, the same logic would give the Portuguese, the Omanis, and 72 different tribes from the Arabian Peninsula that same legitimacy. The claim doesn't concern us because even the Shah of Iran, Mohammed Reza Pahlavi, according to the archives held at the National Archives in Kew Gardens, recognized that Bahrain wasn't Persian territory. He simply wanted a face-saving formula to officially relinquish the claim without losing his popularity. I quote that, and appearing to have colluded with foreign powers. What concerns us for this discussion is the following. Bahraini officials historically worked on a diplomatic solution to this, and ensured that this was settled prior to the official recognition of Bahrain as a fully sovereign country. They did so fully aware of the importance of not leaving such claims lingering. They worked with local powers, and the solution involved a UN mission headed by Vittorio Winspear Gicardi, who was an Italian diplomat. He was also the special rapporteur of the UN Secretary General, and was sent to Bahrain to ascertain, that was the mandate, to ascertain the views of the Bahraini people. The wording, the mandate, the purpose of this mission was a diplomatic success for Bahrain. The results were, of course, even more successful. He spent weeks in Bahrain. He spent time discussing with various representatives of Bahrain's social mix, and he came with the conclusion that, and I quote, "My consultations have convinced me that the overwhelming majority of the people of Bahrain wish to gain recognition of their identity in a fully independent and sovereign state free to decide for itself its relations with other states." This is a really important episode in Bahrain's contemporary history. It's facilitated Bahrain's accession to the UN and set the tone for Bahrain as a fully sovereign Arab country. It's also set the tone that our foreign policy is built on diplomatic settlements for disputes. Interestingly, between 71 and 79, Bahrain and Iran enjoyed friendly and cordial relations. Iran was a powerful country with a powerful army, and with all this historical animosity, one that touches upon maybe the sacrosanct principle of sovereignty, yet Bahrain and Iran both enjoyed friendly political and economic relations after this episode. This is embedded with lessons for young Bahrainis, and yet this episode is not given the credit it deserves in history books, because it doesn't neatly and comfortably fit the mold of an easygoing narrative. And perhaps it's also due to tensions that characterize the current climate, or perhaps the general approach of, we hate that it happened, so we don't want to discuss it in details. Regardless, when aspiring diplomats apply to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and when I ask them about this episode, I'm repeatedly shocked at their lack of knowledge of this episode in detail. The other example I would also like to share is of the left-wing movements that dominated the political scene of the Arab world during the decades between 1930 roughly and 1970. These movements ranged in political agendas and beliefs, and also ranged in terms of the means of operation. Some, for example, believed in armed struggle being the only answer. These movements, whether we obviously agree with their ideology or not, were influenced the landscape of the Arab world and the greater Middle East. In Bahrain, during the 1950s, an organic political movement emerged, the Higher Executive Council, HE Omar. They used advanced political tools such as petitioning, strikes, and they issued circulars and pamphlets. They wrote publicly in newspapers and specifically demanded less intervention by Britain in the internal affairs of Bahrain. They were diplomatic at their inception and even wrote in the first published article, and I quote, "The demands for these reforms are in no way meant to touch the ruler's authority for the statutes of the ruling family, nor do they clash with the interests of Her Majesty's government and the friendly relations existing between them." Amazingly, the ruler responds and sends a letter and opens up a door for dialogue and reform. This is in 1955 Bahrain. Things evolved, obviously, and the events in the Arab world, specifically the events in Egypt, greatly influenced the public. And when the former Foreign Minister Selwyn Lloyd visited Bahrain, he was met with angry crowds and some violence took place. While Bahrain was a British protectorate and not a colony, the growing animosity in the Arab world made Britain very sensitive to such responses, and it triggered the dismantling of the Hay'a after protests took place in Bahrain in response to the Suez Canal tripartite attack. 3 leaders of the 6 were held responsible and sentenced to prison in St. Helena, where they were probably accompanied by Napoleon's ghost. Sorry for the bad joke. They remained there until 1961, and then they were pardoned. So why do I think this historical episode matters, and matters especially to Bahraini diplomats? one of the three who were sent to St. Helena, Abdulaziz al-Shamlan, was one of the people who contributed to drafting Bahrain's constitution, which was adopted in 1973. He was elected as a member of the Constitutional Assembly, and the assembly was made of 42 members, 22 were elected and 20 were appointed to debate and draft Bahrain's constitution. Moreover, in 1974, Abdulaziz al-Shamlan, who was a traditional Arab nationalist, was appointed as Bahrain's ambassador to Cairo, out of all. The advanced nature of political awareness in Bahrain is astonishing, and it is probably largely credited to the early appearance of formal education in 1919, of social clubs in 1929, of the printing press and independent newspapers in 1939. And we see appearances or the appearance of principles of self-determination, political organization, and the openness of the ruler and his response in negotiations, which according to the British residents, and I quote, was considerably beyond anything done elsewhere in the region. The episodes I briefly showcase is, again, either not taught enough or not taught at all. I personally teach this to young diplomats aged 20 plus. So my question is the following: why do we avoid teaching historical narratives if one element of the narrative doesn't neatly fit into what we're used to as comfortable? Teaching history should not be comfortable. And if we expect people to understand our story, our message, our principles, our culture, as diplomats, as ambassadors, we need to convey our history. But before conveying our history, we need to understand it in its entirety. Perhaps not the history that sits well with us, and not the history that serves certain groups, but the history as it is. And then we can enable the diplomat, give him or her a holistic message to convey. That's what I prepared. I hope I didn't bore you with all these historical...
No, not at all. That was fantastic. And you got me thinking about all of these different occasions where I, as a diplomat in different countries, was actually astonished that the people I was speaking to had a better understanding of our history than we did. And that's because they have a lot of documentation, they have access. I also found that, and I think we've had these conversations before, you and I, the idea is, what are we giving up in not learning our history, teaching our history, and actually writing our history? And I wonder at a moment whether history is not the history of the powerful, or in our particular case in the region, whether history isn't written behind closed doors. And so there's that problem, because there are a lot of stories that you will hear when you speak to older people in the region, and they'll say, but this is what happened at this point, that was why that happened. And I often think that if we could just do an oral history and actually collect all of this, we as, at least my generation and then all of the generations that follow me, will have a much better understanding of what it is that explains our existence. Just to also give you an example, I've been working on a project for the last few weeks that requires me to delve into some of these historical questions. And I now think, had I known these were the drivers for unity, growth, development, and all that, I would have done a much more interesting and better job as a diplomat. So I commend you on making sure that history is taken seriously. And I also think that it's very exciting to look at the difficult points in our history and try to understand what exactly took place, because we have this tendency in the region to say, everything was beautiful, willpower, desire, unity, and then we did it. But actually, the real story is one of negotiation, reading people's personalities, understanding small little groupings, how they all interact with each other. Sometimes it's one individual who makes the difference positively, and sometimes it's that same individual who'll make the difference negatively. So I think that's absolutely fascinating. So why do you think that history isn't really being taught in the region, even outside of the diplomatic corps, outside of government, at universities, for example?
I think it's a combination of factors, quite honestly. I think I mentioned contemporary history, and I think contemporary history is being largely overlooked. And I think it's because our curriculums were written at a time when people lived through those events. So that history needs to be taught the way it should be taught now. I mean, our parents probably lived through these episodes in the 60s and the 70s. We certainly didn't. So I think that that's a factor. I think it's also, we tend to shy away, and I think we've had this discussion before, and you just mentioned that if it doesn't fit neatly and comfortably, then we don't want to touch it. Or we'll just sprinkle a little bit of it in the textbook, and then we will not delve into it. Sometimes that's counterproductive, because I mean, I remember attending a talk about Sheikh Zayed and his attempt to unify the UAE, and it wasn't an easy job. I think it's a testament to his character when you show what he actually had to go through. But to make it easy and simple, it doesn't really show, it doesn't give people, historical figures, really important, the credit that they deserve. History is a combination of stories of victors and of people and their flaws, and it's embedded with so many different intricacies that we really have to pay attention to.
And often the younger people will think, oh, well, you know, this all happened and it was quite straightforward. And so just as a small example, people would ask me, and with some jealousy, what was it like to be an ambassador? And I would say, well, you've got to be really humble, because the amount of humbling that you are subject to is quite remarkable. You know, not everybody respects you for your position, and not everybody respects you for where you came from or come from. So if you think when, in the case of Sheikh Zayed, the amount of energy that he put over the years in persuading so many different parties that this was a good idea, that this idea would survive, and then once the foundation had actually been set up, to continue to push over, you know, decades to make sure that it continued to survive. All of this is stuff that our our youthful population needs to understand. And I think in a way they would truly begin to appreciate what it is that we have in the region.
Definitely, I completely agree. And I see this with young diplomats, Bahraini diplomats, when I start sharing these episodes. Sometimes I just feel that I actually enjoy learning and teaching about them, or teaching these episodes. But I realize that they also, they're hungry for these historical episodes, because they feel that sense of attachment to their contemporary. And it gives people a sense of roots. And it also shows the different layers of society. It allows people to convey the message. Obviously, as a diplomat, you'll convey it to the different audiences in different ways. I'm sure the narratives that you presented as an ambassador in Moscow would differ from different, I mean, aspects that you would highlight in different nations. It depends on the interests of the people. It depends, but it does not remove from how you understand the story, how you understand the narrative, how you look at what you went through, and how you analyze it. So I think that people are actually hungry for this, and I hope, and I already see a push in the Arab world, in the Arab Gulf, to document these narratives, because if we don't, then, you know, people will document them the way they want to. You don't preserve in its entirety.
Yeah. Well, I'm often surprised that, you know, the idea that if you want to read a good history of the region, you have to find it in English, written by an Englishman or an American perhaps. And it really surprises me that we haven't reacted against this and said, actually, you know what, there's a different history that we can write about the region. And I suppose I wanted to move on to another area. Where do you see the role of women in diplomacy and in government in the Gulf region? Because there have been tremendous changes over the last few years.
Well, I see this as obviously a progressive field. It's a changing field. It's a field that I personally feel very proud of. I'm happy to share this personal information. My grandmother was illiterate. She did not read or write. My mother went to a teaching institute, so she did her, I mean, she did a diploma. I have a PhD. So the jumps are huge for women, huge. And they're being received very openly. I always thought that joining a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in which it's traditionally male dominated, that I would face that type of, it would be more difficult than it actually was. I was ready for a crusade, but it was very easy. It was very simple. I was never treated differently as a woman. If anything, it just felt that it was, a room that slowly had more and more women.
Yeah.
Um, I do feel that I hope we get to see more women in the field of diplomacy. And this is not just the Arab world, this is in general. I do hope to see women in government. And again, this is not just the Arab world, but in general. I am very optimistic about it. I do feel that these changes are inspirational for all of us.
I was gonna suggest that actually the Gulf states are now less patriarchal than some of our Western colleagues, our Western allies. But you know, I leave that.
I actually recall walking into a UN, I think it was a side session in Geneva. It was an event where the equal pay was being discussed.
Yeah.
I literally stopped and I said, "Equal pay? Is that where we're at?" I really
Yeah.
hope that we're way beyond equal pay, but thankfully in the government, Bahrain, it is equal pay all the way.
That's very good. I get the impression that we have unequal pay in the other direction. Women have surpassed us.
I'm not going to answer to that.
So what is your idea of a model diplomat, and how has that idea changed with the most recent developments around COVID?
Well, to be quite honest, I've always had a traditional approach to human interaction. I enjoy human interaction. I like social settings. Now with COVID, I feel like diplomacy has really had to adapt in terms of being able to still reach your targets without that human touch. And I feel that people who are used to that human interaction to get to places to establish these social relations have had to really adapt to keep these social relations, but through phone calls, through webinars, through WhatsApp calls, videos, whatever it is that we had to really quickly adapt to. So I think it just probably reinforces the understanding that a diplomat has to adapt to different social circumstances, has to adapt to different living conditions. And COVID is essentially us adapting to not being able to enjoy everything that we normally do. So I think that diplomats have adapted. I just feel that the political settings have changed. I know that, for example, we often prepare diplomats for the UN Security Council meetings or the UN General meetings in New York. And that type of training is very intensive, and it gives people the opportunity to be outside their comfort zone because they leave the country, they go abroad. We're sort of in the comfort or not of our homes. That essence of being taken from where you're rooted and being posted in positions elsewhere is a bit different now. So I don't know if I answered that, but
no, you have answered. But I also think I'm relying in this now Zoom world that we're living in. I'm relying very much on the relationships that I made face to face. And you know, it's in that sense that I'm able to continue them and explore different sides of them over Zoom. It's difficult to say to see whether I'd be able to form new relationships with through technology. And I just wonder whether that's not going to be a major stumbling block for younger diplomats who haven't been out in the field, who haven't really spent time abroad, and so on.
And I feel they're discouraged as well. They used to look forward to that. So now they feel a bit strange in terms of how am I going to actually attend that meeting? How am I going to carve a name for myself? How am I going to actually attend? I mean, I heard from our ambassador in New York that now countries are celebrating their national day on Zoom. And so other ambassadors would actually go in on Zoom, congratulate that country and leave. And again, going back to how technologically inept I am, it just seemed like, where's the human aspect of all of this? You have to adapt.
You have to adapt, but something's going to change. And I also remember watching some of the diplomats of rivals. And so there is this idea of a polished diplomat who can converse in multiple languages, who is at ease in sophisticated locations and at events. But there's another kind of diplomat that I observed who was very rough and ready, was persistent, had the thickest skin in the universe, and would not let go of his counterpart in whatever country until he got, the information, the deal, or something like that. And again, what happens to those guys? Yeah? Unless, they're all COVID positive and they don't care, right?
Multilateral settings, the discussions that happen behind closed doors, the negotiations that happen. I think, or I hope that this is just a test for all of us, and that we'll go back to having and maintaining these human interactions eventually. It's opened our eyes to one, being grateful for everything that we have, to really learning how to adapt in terms of working from home, working remotely. I've been very personally, or I've been pleasantly surprised with my team at the academy. I have majority women in my team, and the majority,
nothing less.
A big chunk of them are mothers, and they have managed to homeschool their kids and give 110% to their job. I'm also a mother of 3, and I genuinely tell you that this is very difficult. So I really appreciate this effort that goes into it. It's very difficult for women to balance and juggle, I think.
Absolutely. Well, can I ask you also, one of the questions that came up in previous discussions was the way in which the world is kind of dividing. There's an America and a China pole, and there's a lot of kind of uncertainty as to what kind of world we're going to be coming into with the elections in the US and then the outcome of that. Are you optimistic? Is Bahrain? I mean, I'm assuming you guys are optimistic, but how do you see small states like Bahrain, like the UAE, fitting into a world where there's potentially this massive rivalry coming on?
So you mean we're coming out of 2020 intact? Is that the assumption?
Because no, there are no assumptions. If you want us not to come out intact, I'll ready to follow that line of thought.
No, I genuinely am optimistic. And in terms of diplomacy and international relations, I do see these changes coming up. I do feel that we, as small countries, have to put more of an effort for our voice to be heard. I think that we are doing that. We're doing that in terms of how we tell our story. We understand our interests, and we project our image to the rest of the world. Bahrain is an island. It's a small island. It has a very unique story historically. And so I do feel that Bahraini diplomats understand that there's a difference between Bahrain as an island and a small island and China. I do feel that once you understand that and you really understand the differences, then you position the country in a certain way. Whether we're going to a world of, it's China against the US, or whether we're going into a world where, you see more emerging markets coming up and you see a world of multipolarity rather than that bipolarity, I don't know. I do see that the wave of groups in the Arab world is dying down. I mean, we spoke about the left-wing movements that came and swept through the Arab world and then died out. And then so, groups that were more extreme in terms of identifying across religion and religious lines, unfortunately using religion for power gains. And I think that's dying out. So I do see a new wave, and I genuinely see the young people coming up, and that being the next, I hope that being the next wave.
Fantastic. So I'm watching some of the questions coming up, and so they're very interesting. I'd like to say that I've already asked most of them, but that's not the case. There's one that's about Gulf diplomats being active internationally in negotiations and conflict mediation. Is that not something that the Gulf countries could do? Smaller countries like Bahrain. And I know that our colleagues in Qatar have presented themselves as mediators in many ways. I think how I would see us differing is that the Qataris know a lot of parties, and whether they mediate or they construct solutions is something to be discussed. How do you think the other smaller countries of the Gulf could do something like that?
I have approached at least teaching at the diplomatic institute or the academy now in terms of mediating or mediation being one of the key components that hope to aspire to achieve. I think that Bahrain is also neatly and perhaps the UAE and geopolitically situated in an area of conflicts around us. And I've always said to my young diplomats, you can be arbitrators of, the Kashmir crisis, of you could be positioned in that sense, and you have that. I do see there's a lot of potential there. I think that we have traditionally been reserved unless we're invited, because and I speak on behalf of at least my understanding of Bahrain policy. We don't interfere with the internal affairs of other countries.
Same.
Unlike perhaps other mediators. And so what we tend to do is take a more, the bystander role. This is an issue between these two states. Unless we're invited, we wouldn't really delve in. I think that as long as we're ready to be mediators, we're ready to be open and act as mediators, I think that there's a lot of potential there.
It's true. There are so many conflicts out there that are looking for mediators. So I agree. I think one of the reasons why that was an interesting question is because in the Emirates, we know that we played a significant role in mediating between Ethiopia and Eritrea. But also in the same way that we have not talked about our history in great detail, we're given more of a result rather than the process itself. How did we actually get involved? What was it that initially pulled us into that? How did we develop relationships with both sides? What allowed us to demonstrate trustworthiness to both sides and both parties? And then what was the nitty gritty? I mean, how many people in the Emirates actually know about the internal politics of either of those countries to be able to say come up with a solution? So I think there is hope. There's a lot of potential, and I find it admirable that you are encouraging your diplomats to see themselves in that sense, really a global role as opposed to just specifically representing Bahrain's interests.
Well, sometimes an outsider, as you mentioned, and I see maybe potential of solving conflicts that are perhaps non-Arab related, because sometimes if you're an outsider, it's seen you're seen as more neutral. I mean, the FARC deal in Colombia was, I think it was a Norwegian diplomat or someone from Scandinavia that was negotiating. So I think that's something that shows us that maybe as an outsider, you might be more accepted.
Agreed. And I remember when I was at the UN in the early 90s, there was one particular representative of a country. The country was an island state, miles away from any other country, no significant natural resources. But this particular diplomat was astounding because he was at the heart of every key debate. He was at the heart of every key grouping of important diplomats, and he was the one who was coming up with solutions for the others. So these are very inspiring stories for small states, I think, because even through the personality of one individual diplomat or two, you can project a tremendous amount of power and goodwill in that sense.
Just give me 10 to 15 years, and you'll be one of our diplomats.
Inshallah, inshallah. Let me look at another one. We had an anonymous soft power, does that mean anything to us anymore? Or is everything financial power and the power of weaponry?
I think soft power still means, obviously, I'm in the field of training and academia, so
Yeah.
obviously I'm in soft power.
I was provoking you, that's all.
I think it's the field we're in is a testament to that. It shows that
Yeah.
there is so much in terms of culture, in terms of, how Dubai is synonymous with so many different,
Mm,
successes, with the Burj Khalifa, with
mm,
um, there's lots of episodes in history that you really show you the importance of soft power, and I
mm,
think
mm,
we're still going down that route. I see the Arab Gulf taking more initiatives in that sense,
mm,
in the sense of soft power. I think you see tourism opening up in Saudi Arabia, which is
mm,
absolutely beautiful and great to see.
mm.
Soft power in terms of music, literature. I do hope I see more Khaliji music elsewhere.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, you don't know. You see a soft power being something that I hope is a growing field. But in essence, our bread and butter in diplomacy is soft power. It's managing relations
yeah.
through that type of power.
Yeah, and it's quite often the case, having been out in the field of diplomacy, that we will work with diplomats from neighboring states in order to it's almost a tag team, that we support you here, you support us there, because the number of diplomats isn't that large. So you've got to go and support your fellow diplomats in certain areas where you have a say. So I think that's exciting. Uh, do you think that there's a sense in which the Gulf states as a whole, given our common cultural ties, linguistic ties, sort of the aesthetic ties, the way in which we sing our music, the way in which we write our poetry, all of these things come together to actually create a much closer bond than, say, for example, different countries in the European Union? Do you foresee a day when we would actually come out all together and kind of promote a certain kind of perception of how we are?
I certainly hope so. I
Mm,
think we're a small geographical area.
mhm,
Um, we're a smaller number of states. I think it's now it's a bit difficult to see because we have differences that are taking up most of our time in terms of
mhm.
amongst us. But culturally and not politically,
Yeah,
you mentioned even historically, people traveled around and settled where there were
yeah,
opportunities, and so traditionally you would have family, cousins in this country and this country and settled here. So I do see a lot of potential there,
mhm,
and I think even the differences amongst each country is very interesting. So you would have obviously a similar approach to writing
mm,
poems, but there are
yeah,
differences in how you would write it here rather than how you'd write it there.
yeah,
And sometimes you would see even dialect, and dialect is quite important, I think. You'd see some similarities between groups in certain countries based on geography. So
yeah,
in Bahrain, a tiny island, you might see differences between the north and the south,
yeah,
but you would be able to see similarities between the eastern province of Saudi Arabia and the western part of Bahrain. You would
mhm,
see some similarities between how people speak in Qatar and how we speak. So you'll see lots of similarities, but also differences. So I think this is also quite unique, and it's a unique
yeah.
story.
Yeah, you're right. And I think, when I think of a foreigner coming into the Emirates, for example, they look around and they see all men dressed in white, all women dressed in black, and they just assume that this is a very uniform, homogeneous society. But actually, if you dig, even as an Emirati, if you dig around, you will actually find that there's incredible diversity of Emirati with an immense set of histories that are very divergent. And I think right across the Gulf states as well, you'll find the same. So I wonder, do you think at any stage we should actually be doing this type of communicating of who we are to each other? So, I mean, I came and visited Bahrain a few months ago, and you hosted me there very kindly. And you showed me aside, over the course of 2 days, you showed me some things that I'd never imagined. From reading the paper or Googling. So in that sense, you enriched my understanding and knowledge of Bahrain as a state. And I just wonder whether we shouldn't be doing that to each other more, sort of Saudi, Bahrain, Emirat, Kuwait, all, cross-border here in the region.
Of course.
We assume we know each other.
And it gives us a sense of appreciation of each other as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because even in the Emirates, I mean, I've only been to Dubai and Abu Dhabi. I mean, you actually, there's a lot that I haven't seen.
Yeah.
In Kuwait, if you just go to the capital, you haven't seen so many other beautiful places. You haven't driven through the desert. You don't see, and so you don't tend to appreciate it also geographically in terms of people, their differences, how they live with each other, and how they appreciate one another in one. I mean, the difference between Riyadh and Jeddah is astonishing in terms of dialect, but we don't appreciate it enough unless we actually go and speak to people from Jeddah and from Riyadh. The histories are also quite interesting. The communities that have settled in Jeddah, the communities that have settled in Riyadh. And yet, they are part of one entity. And I think it's important that we really appreciate one another, because as you mentioned, if we were to speak of this Khaliji effort at one point, whenever it comes, then we actually have to really pay attention to appreciating it and appreciating all of the nuances. I have just managed to appreciate the nuances in Bahrain. When you host people, you actually also learn so much about your country and its history and all the differences, even in terms of living, ways of living, dialects, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Well, here's another very interesting question. How does it feel? You're training diplomats, and you want those diplomats to go and serve their country, and then along comes a political appointee who has no training in diplomacy whatsoever, and goes and sits, sort of occupies the position of ambassador. What kind of signal does that send to the younger diplomats? What kind of feelings? How do you manage those expectations then?
Well, honestly, half of our ambassadors are I think around half are appointed. I don't think the number and the percentages will remain. And let me tell you why.
Sure.
I think that when the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Bahrain was established as a Directorate of Foreign Affairs in 1968, and just getting ready to become a ministry, all of the ambassadors were appointed. There was no grassroots development of diplomats to ambassador. So you have 100% that were appointed as diplomats, poets, teachers, merchants, various different backgrounds. We actually visited one of them when you were in Bahrain. He's a writer, poet, and then he was appointed as a business owner, and then he was appointed as a diplomat. And then Bahrain took off. This is my perspective, at least. And we still managed to appoint ambassadors, because at this point we're recruiting and people are working up the ladder. And now we have 50% who have been, who have gone up the ranks from diplomatic attaché to ambassador. And you have appointees from various backgrounds. And the backgrounds that they bring, I feel, adds to diplomacy. I genuinely believe that a diplomat is also someone who has the character and the background and a diverse background to be able to, I'm sure as a writer now, as an author, you can start so many conversations, much more than you were able to before you published your book. So I think and writing a book is not a requirement for being an ambassador, but it gives you that I don't know, as a diverse background, it gives you that credibility. So I don't see it as something negative, but
Yeah.
I do see that our young diplomats will take up more and more of these roles.
Hmm.
But also, diplomats tend to move into other positions within the government.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think it's at the end of the day, it works because I think that diplomats work with ambassadors who are political appointees. They see
Hmm.
what they bring to the table,
Yeah.
and they learn from their example.
It's interesting because I'm involved with the Emirates Diplomatic Academy, and one of the things that I see is that our diplomats are going and getting courses at the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company or the Sovereign Wealth Fund, and there's kind of an interaction back and forth between people who are, I mean, even within the National Oil Company, there are people there who will need to understand how diplomacy works and the different kinds of scenarios available for them. So a lot of cross-pollination is going to be very useful. And I've always been in favor of having a varied and diverse past, because it makes it much more exciting to do the job. There is another question that is very interesting. It's about non-governmental organizations. Some of them are becoming extremely powerful. Do you think that at some stage they, we'll have to, in the region, we're going to have to deal with them the way in which we deal with a state? And a similar question to that is, the massive technology companies, massive food companies, companies that can, make or break economies. How do we now begin to deal with those instances?
Well, I mean, this is a massive debate, obviously, in terms of states and non-state actors, and even transnational advocacy networks and
Yeah,
NGOs, and their role. Even through multilateral settings, you see them take more of a powerful role at the UN, for example. Um, I I honestly, I don't know. I think it's also regional. I think that NGOs in the Arab world are not there yet.
yeah,
I think perhaps a lot of these NGOs you see coming in from abroad. I
yeah,
hope that we see more NGOs coming in from the Arab world, but I do think that companies, as you mentioned, various fields. I think we're increasingly becoming, I mean, with COVID aside,
yeah,
interconnected.
yes,
All these fields recognize I mean, even in the military has always been a very traditional institution. But now the military and diplomacy have a very important overlap, for example.
yeah,
Uh, and I do genuinely see that different fields and traditionally conservative occupations are becoming more interconnected with other fields.
yeah.
So I do think that states will always have that power. Um, and I don't know if we, as again, speaking about the Arab world, if we have that type of field here.
Yeah.
I do this as more of a when I see the international scene.
And one more question. I can't help it, actually. These questions are short and really to the point. Here, Tenny says, I appreciate you highlighting the importance of giving visibility to historical narratives. However, denial has been the narrative of diplomacy. How do you think that narrative could be changed? Well, in a way, there is that idea about being a diplomat really papering over the cracks, pretending there is no problem, always being charming and delightful. Uh, in our increasingly interconnected world, and when the other sides, our counterparts, know more about our history than ourselves, it's very difficult to come up with, something
Convincing it.
that is not the truth, right? So is
Uh,
our job now to explain the truth in a way that at least makes us look okay?
I think
Or
expectation. I don't think denial without having an alternative explanation is
yeah,
going to be acceptable.
yeah,
Um, that's why I think, I mean, I think that all states want a certain version of their history public. Um,
Yeah.
every state wants to position their narrative in a golden, or in the most positive light.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
so I think denial will remain in diplomacy. I think this is the reality. But denial without offering an alternative is no
Yeah.
longer acceptable, because people can access, materials, can access the truth, or can access the actual things that will remove
Yeah.
from your legitimacy as a diplomat, and you will no longer be able to carry the
Yeah.
narrative in the same way. So I do think that this emphasis on understanding history, understanding exactly
Yeah.
what happened.
Yeah.
As a diplomat, you might not want to share 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the way
Sure.
that it's written. You might see 1, 2, 3 and maybe brush 4, 5.
Yeah.
That's the reality, because the person in front of you might have been impacted by 4 and 5, for
Hmm.
example.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
but if you don't know those points, you won't be able to deny it in the way that
Yeah.
will give you that weight. I don't know if
Yeah.
that's a
Yeah.
question. It's a tough
No,
question.
that's great. Uh, so, Dr. Muneera, we're coming towards the end of the hour. Somebody had also a question about recommending books or resources on the history of the region. Maybe we can close on that. You can come up with your books, and I'm going to answer that question in a completely different way.
Um, I think my answer is not going to be a very good answer.
Yeah.
I don't think there are enough books on the region written by people from the region.
Yeah.
Uh, I think that, as you mentioned, if we want to learn about the region, we often tend to resort to um, uh, not very thorough understandings of our region. But I do think that there's an honest attempt by some scholars.
Yes.
Um, on Bahrain specifically, there's an anthropologist who was actually my external examiner, and she's based in Abu Dhabi,
Uh-huh.
Nalida Fakr. She's an anthropologist, and she wrote a history on Manama,
Uh-huh.
um, specifically. I don't agree with everything that she's written, but I agree with her enough to be able to realize that it is a good piece of scholarship. So Nalida Fakaro is her name, and I think it's Manama History of a Tribe and State, and she
Fantastic.
looks at the urban development of Manama. There's a lot of, I mean, I'll leave the rest to you. And I think that perhaps if anyone hasn't read Ibn Khaldun, I
Yes.
think I've mentioned this to you. I went to a school with the name of Ibn Khaldun, and I only read Ibn Khaldun when I went to Oxford and someone mentioned Ibn Khaldun, and I realized I read Ibn Khaldun. So the Muqaddimah is, I read it in English, unfortunately, and then I went back to read it in Arabic. But it's a very good, um, it doesn't it doesn't detail historical narratives, but it
Yeah.
enables tools for you to appreciate history and understand it in a specific way. I leave it to you to answer as well.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to say the most interesting history I've read has been the history of the Roman Empire. And I used to wonder why that would be interesting until I started reading it. It just shows the immense intricacy of human relations. And another area of history that I think was exceptionally useful was medieval European history, uh, Western Europe, the kings of France, Italian history, English history, British history. Is absolutely fascinating to show you what is possible in terms of human relations, from the lowest all the way up to the highest. And I think if you have that kind of historical understanding of what human beings can actually do to each other in order to attain what they want, it really is eye-opening. And the reason I say that is because it's difficult to get historical books here in the region or about the Arab world that gives you that same sense of deep understanding.
There's also David Fromkin, I think, A Peace to End All Peace.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
it focuses on a different area, it doesn't focus on the Gulf as much,
Yeah.
but it's also an interesting read.
And Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Muneera. It really has been an honor to have you with us on today's program. And I'm really pleased with all the people who attended. So thank you very much. Oh,
Thank you.
stay safe, as they say.
I hope that the next time we see one another, it will be actually either you revisiting Bahrain or me visiting the UAE
Inshallah.
in attempt,
Inshallah.
as you mentioned, understand and appreciate all the intricacies that make us quite unique.
Absolutely. And you have to come and visit the Emirates Diplomatic Academy when you're here. Thank you
Well,
so much. Thank you
very
so
much.
much, everybody. Thank you. Good night. Bye-bye.